We're in the middle of reports, and so a lot of you were here Wednesday night, and we got started on everybody who was here who had the reports. Fantastic reports, not trying to make it scary for those of you who haven't given your reports yet. They were great, which means we can expect the same kind of level of that's coming from here. And so, as you'll remember, we're going through this great chapter of faith, and we're trying to ask ourselves, what was it about these people that made them faithful? And what are the things that they demonstrated? Even the kind of things we've heard this morning in our sermon. And then what they have to overcome. Or either some of their own weaknesses or some of the things that they had to overcome. And we've heard a lesson this morning that's straight in line with what we're doing here. What's interesting here in this chapter is the Hebrew writer gives example after example after example, all driving toward the same point. And we've heard that point this morning. We're going to see how the Hebrew writer makes it as we continue to go through this. So with all that being said, who hasn't given a report and wants to start us today? We haven't been taking, we've taken, there we go. I see you right there. So we'll go with you, Margie.
I have Abraham.
Excellent.
I think it's interesting, first of all, that God chose Abraham because his father, according to Joshua 24:2, was an idolater that worshipped other gods. And I think it's interesting that Abraham was chosen. And at 75 years old, he just packed up and left. Didn't know where he was going, really. And he believed that God had promised him a son. He and his wife had no children at that time. And I think he was thoughtful, unselfish, and generous whenever he let his nephew Lot choose which land he wanted, if he wanted up in the hills or if he wanted down in the Green Valley. And let's see. Then, of course, the great faith was actually to take his son to be a sacrifice. And I mean, he didn't just take him up there. He told his son, you know, that God will provide the sacrifice. But, I mean, he laid him on the altar and had his knife raised before God stopped him. And I don't know of anybody that would do that. You know, and let's see. There's a very significant figure throughout the Bible, and being the father of the Jews. But
what weaknesses did he have, Margie?
well, for one thing, now a wife can be a great influence. I understand. But he listened to Sarah and had the son that by her handmaiden, and that was wrong. I mean, that was a weakness, I would say. And then there's, on two different occasions, he lied about being the husband of Sarah, and because he feared for his life. He thought he would be killed. And even though it was just a little white lie, it was still a lie is a lie, no matter how you color it.
Incomplete truth, right?
Yes.
You didn't reveal what was full of truth.
But I have a question. With Lazarus and the rich man, and Lazarus was carried away to Abraham's bosom, is that our Abraham?
What Jesus said, yep, that's the same one.
I think that's certainly a plus. That the faithful are carried away to his bosom, you know.
When we ask God for things, when do we expect them?
Immediately.
Whenever he wants.
How
Oh, we
about
expect
today?
it immediately. Yeah.
How about today? Sometimes that's how we pray. What about Abraham?
Very patient.
Decade after decade after decade.
And it was tough because he was susceptible to being impatient, right? Because this whole Sarah Hagar incident was about being, well, maybe God needs a little help instead of relying on him. A little impatient there. Let's try another way here.
Well, yeah, at 75 he was promised a son, but he didn't have it till he was 100. So that's 25 years. That's a lot of
Lessons
patience.
for us. Gotta be patient.
Yep.
Yes.
Our timeline's not God's timeline. It's not. We want it, but we want it by Thursday.
It's too long.
It's too long.
Whether it's that new car or that dog or whatever. We don't.
Whatever. Yeah. Anybody, what else? Anybody else got on Abraham? Pluses or minuses?
Saying like the impatience, it was kind of like double fold because Sarah was really doubtful that that could even happen because of her old age.
Yeah, yeah. She had the same impatience as she showed doubts too. That's exactly right.
Which is not, I mean, easy. I mean, when you grow up with your spouse, I mean, not that I've had a spouse for very long, but even at that, like that, that tension is there that you want to, especially in their culture, they wanted to have offspring. It's a bigger deal.
What else? Anybody got anything else on Abraham?
All right, let's get the next chapter. Okay, we get some more people to get through here. Dennis, you had?
Samson.
Yes, you did. Good deal.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Why did God choose Samson? I mean, that's a question a lot of people ask. Like, when you read the story, I mean, not as a kid. It was a feel-good story as a kid. But when you grow up and you start reading into it, you question, why did God choose Samson? He was a womanizer. He abused his strength. He abused the gifts that God gave him.
He didn't appear to have respected his parents all that much because he demanded that they go down there and get that woman for him. Instead of saying, well, I really would like that, and what do you think, Dad? He said, you go do it. And I didn't like that part of Samson.
You're gonna notice that side of the board.
Thank you.
That side of the board's gonna have a lot more
It's
than
gonna
this
have a lot
side.
more, yeah.
Was he a violent man?
He didn't have any self-control. Lack of
Lack of
self-control.
Big time.
He went against his parents' will.
He had a violent anger. Oh, you got that.
Violent anger, I like that. That's it.
Okay.
When his anger rose up, he became violent.
And he did walk by faith. So we can put in Samson that at the
Eventually.
end, he showed his faith in God. He did deliver the Israelites from the bondage of the Philistines. He had physical strength. His hair was his strength, and his lack of hair was his weakness. But at the end, when his hair started to grow and God gave him the strength to kill those 3,000 people that were mocking him and that gouged out his eyes, because that really was where his weakness was in his eyes. He saw things like the beautiful woman that he wanted, he lusted after. So.
Have you ever wondered, I know you said that, Dennis, have you ever wondered, just like you said, all these great men, why is Samson there? Samson didn't make it to heaven or to heaven. He could have. Well, God put him there that he did.
Yeah. That even in our weaknesses.
At the very end. And he was not a good man until the end.
It wasn't that he didn't show any faith until the end.
Yeah.
The Spirit of the Lord would rise up in him, and then he would smite the Philistines. It was very, but it maybe say that his faith was episodic. He just had episodes of faith. He wasn't characterized by faith throughout his life.
No.
But he would have episodes of faith, but in the end, he had one final episode.
Does that give us hope?
Yes.
Oh,
Oh, it should.
it sure should.
Well, it shows anybody could become a Christian.
And if you struggle with it, even if your faith wanes and you go through peaks and valleys, keep with it. You might be called on to pull the building down, but you got to do it, right?
And like what Jordan said this morning, never
Give up.
never quit. Sometimes we want to quit or we quit, at least temporarily, but you don't quit, can't do it.
All of these people, I think, helped me a lot because they do go through peaks and valleys. None of them were even close to perfect, but they had faith, and they would come back when they would go the wrong direction. They would come back to God, and in the end, God always forgave them, and He will us if we genuinely repent and come back to Him.
Absolutely.
Okay, who wants to go next? Linda.
I've got Noah. I think that he's a character of faith because he did what God told him to do without any question. He's obedient.
And it was an easy thing to do, right?
No,
Go 400 foot
it
boat.
wasn't an easy thing to do. I'm sure
I've
he
seen
got
that
a lot
boat, it was big.
of grief over that.
Well, he never asked why. He was told to build a boat, and he was like, okay, whatever. Here.
Yeah, there are boats and there are 400-foot ships. And
He had 3 boys too.
and he built it in 100 years. How do you think he was treated by his neighbors? Now, keep in mind, it appears at that point it had never rained on the earth. That the earth was watered by a mist. So you're telling your people going, hey, Noah, what are you doing, dude? That's a big boat. It's never rained before. What are you, some kind of nut? For 100 years. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of a silly point, but Austin and I were actually just talking about it last night. The thought, like, one of my biggest fears are like spiders, scorpions. Like, they had to live with all the creatures of the earth for the whole time, and like, it just being like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure there were probably things that they didn't want to have to live in close quarters with for that long, but just having faith in like, this is what has to happen. Obviously that's a very trivial first world problem to think about, but
I think one of the things that Mitch, what you kind of said there, I mean, that Noah basically lived a lifetime of ridicule up until the point of the flood. I mean, it was a lifetime, you know. Most of his adult life, he was ridiculed for what he was doing, obeying God. So,
We ever been ridiculed? Hey, y'all weird.
Every day.
I mean, you don't run like the world runs? No, we don't. You strange, what, some kind of a religious nut? No, just average, good people.
We're even called hateful bigots sometimes.
Or we're called lots of things.
show any weakness? Find anything in the story
I
that,
guess you would say mainly lack of self-control. I mean, he was a drinker and got drunk.
at the end of his life, he certainly did.
Yeah.
And it caused an incident, that incident that happened because he was drunk, ultimately
Got shunned,
Condemned
Ham
coming-
got shunned.
condemned his son because of that, because his son, he almost induced his son into committing something that was a sin, just because of his own drunkenness there. And the other
Yeah.
two brothers, you know,
Kind of have to read between the lines a
Yeah.
little bit.
so. Okay, good.
Good.
Who else?
Go ahead.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
Shannon.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
I missed it, sorry. Go next. Go
So who's going first?
Go
ahead,
ahead,
Shannon.
Shannon.
I had Gideon. He was, I guess, God gave him the title of angel of the Lord.
Or
And he was chosen by God to save Israel from the Midianites. And
After he presented the Lord, I guess, with his offerings, he was instructed to destroy the altar of Baal. And eventually he saved Israel. He overcame the hatred from destroying the altar of Baal. So, and his weakness, he was doubted by God.
No, he doubted God.
He doubted that he could destroy.
And asked God for signs that it was really God telling him. Right.
And then he asked God for signs that God was telling him, that you're doing the right thing. That you're doing the correct.
And you almost get the sense you read that story, asking for it once was kind of okay, but it was kind of like over and over again. He kept saying, well, God, now do this. Now it's like,
Yeah, he kept
we read some
looking for
impatience,
signs.
right?
Well, because as we were reading it, he wasn't sure if it was really God talking to him, and so I was like, okay, God, if this really you,
Yeah.
Show me a sign.
So that could indicate, couldn't it, that his faith wavered at times?
probably
I know you
a
showed
lot.
me once, but could you show me again? How about third?
Third, fourth.
I've always sort of wondered why Barak was mentioned in there, because he said, okay, I'll go, but I'm not gonna go without Deborah.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
So one more thing I want to get is, anybody remember the story of what happened with the spoils after the war? I mean, after everything had gone good, what happened with Gideon? Were you able to read that part of the story? Does anyone remember? What did he make? Remember what he made with what did he ask for from all the people after they killed those?
Their jewelry
Yeah, give me their earrings.
made an idol.
Well, he made an ephod, which was not in and of itself, but what did it become? It became an idol. So to a people that had a propensity to worship idols, he made something that they could make into an idol. So it might have been a little pride in there. He wanted to wear the victory vest. That's what the ephod was. It was the victory vest. And so, I think that shows, there was some pride at least in that. While it wasn't he didn't make it to be an idol, it turned into one over time. Good, good. Well, now that you were going into Barak, now let's hit Barak.
Well, I don't know much about him, except he would go, but he said, I'm not gonna go unless Deborah goes with me. Well, she did, of course, and they won the battle, but she got the credit for it, which she should have.
That's right,
Is asking for help a strength or a weakness?
It's a strength.
Absolutely.
Well, the world considers it a weakness, unfortunately. Does that make any sense?
It does. I mean, and there's no doubt of that. When we see other people who were willing to kind of go it alone, Barak wasn't, but what is true of Barak?
He went.
He went.
He went.
Even when I needed somebody to kind of help me along and I wanted to be in this with somebody else, and he expressed that, which is all right. If you need help, express it. But then you actually got to have it, right? And he did. And that, some people want help and then they didn't really want help. They didn't really want to do what they needed to do.
And they want all the credit, and he didn't seem to care who got the credit.
So we really see his character through all that, even though he wanted that help, he then took it.
So that's a lot of our problem today, is our pride gets in the way and we don't even want to ask for help, because then that's admitting we're weak.
Unless it's that, or we get something that's helpful and we decide we don't want to do that because that's not what we really wanted to hear. So, and looking at that. Great, okay. Another character, who we got left? Portia, you're next. Samuel,
I
right?
got Samuel. He was Israel's final judge. He was a Nazarite. His strength was he was a man of integrity. He had a good reputation. He was faithful to God from childhood to death. he was obedient to Eli. He obeyed Eli by telling him what God had spoken to him. He had a positive influence on Israel because he preached God's word and held people accountable. His weakness was, he had two wicked sons who were like Eli's two sons. He had made his two sons judges over Israel, but his sons were just wicked. And I was reading somewhere where, you know, they said even though Samuel was a good person, you know, he had wicked sons, and it's like, well, I don't know if he's to blame because of his sons. He had, you know, he was a positive influence, but his sons just weren't, they just went the other way.
It's always a difficult situation, isn't it? Was it the parents' fault or not? Because sometimes it's not, and the children go astray anyway. But he certainly repeated the pattern of Eli, right? That's who.
Yes.
And what's interesting is Eli grew up Samuel, and Samuel, you know, Eli was his mentor, along with his sons. And Samuel turned out great, and the sons weren't. So it's tough, but it certainly. Remember when he made them judges, what happened next? Remember how the people reacted to that? We want a king.
Right.
Yeah, we want a king. This is almost what pushed it over the edge, that we're tired of these judges, because we don't want these judges to be there. So I even wonder if Samuel consulted God about this, because that seems to be exactly the wrong move. But we don't know, the Bible doesn't say.
And, you know, the Lord told Samuel to give them what they want, and
Give them the king. Yeah.
they regretted that.
He said, they're not rejecting you,
They're rejecting me.
they're rejecting me.
Yes.
But it does seem odd that Eli's sons were bones, Samuel's sons were bones, that it seems more than coincidental that there was some parental issues there.
Yeah, and that's what, where I was doing the research, it kind of brought that out. Anyway, so the lessons learned here, it says the people wanted a king, but other nations had kings, and it wasn't pleasing to God. He wanted his people to be different, and that's what he wants for us today, to be different. And sometimes, a lot of times it's hard for us to be different because we don't want to stand out. But that's the only way we're going to make an influence, is to be different. That's about it.
Good,
That's all I have.
excellent.
Yeah.
Jeanette?
Right, I had the Israelites at Jericho, and so they show that they were characters of faith by following God's exact instruction, even though it was completely made no sense and unconventional. They did it without hesitation. They did it without grumbling, from what it sounds like. And they didn't make any adaptations to what he had commanded them to do, or what God had told Joshua for them to do. And because you hear of all of these things where people made an adaptation and God struck them down or didn't fulfill his promise because they didn't. So I kind of feel like they had learned lessons along the way. I thought of like Noah, like they had learned, like God took care of Noah because he followed the exact instruction of building the ark. And they also probably thought of, you know, the previous generation who had come through the wilderness and they had grumbled and God had done all of these things. So I think they had kind of used lessons from the past to help them realize that God was actually going to be with them and deliver Jericho to them for following that. And they also fulfilled the promise by sparing Rahab and her family. So they were trustworthy and following through with that.
I mean, how long had that promise been given before that? About 40 years, right?
Yeah.
Just shy of that, when the
Right.
spies were in the land the first time, right?
Mm-hmm. So it was kind of hard to find a weakness because they had followed
Jericho,
all
they
the
were great.
instructions. Correct, yeah, Jericho definitely, I think they were kind of given warning too, so I mean, you've got people marching around you. So Jericho definitely had their weaknesses, so, but as for the Israelites, in this
They almost had to think
situation.
later than this. Did they perfectly did what God asked them at Jericho. What about
Well,
after?
and for sure later on, because God said like never rebuild here, and there were instances throughout that they did rebuild onto Jericho, and it never,
Right.
nothing ever sustained. So yes, the future Israelites did not follow God's command to not.
What had these people over the last 40 years witnessed out of maybe anywhere from 2 to 5 million people other than 2 men over the age of 20? They all dead.
Right.
Every single one of them dead. That were over the age of 20 except 2 men, Joshua and Caleb. So if you're ever going to learn a lesson, Grandma, Grandpa, Great-Grandpa, they all buried out there in the desert somewhere. I think we might want to listen to this.
And I did have that they
Seems like.
recognized
Yeah.
Joshua's
Yeah.
faith and his power, and they trusted his leadership.
And there's a little bit of but they didn't go and fully do that everywhere and drive out all the Israelites, and they suffered the rest of their history for that. And they kind of lost. The start was fantastic, right? Yeah, Samson, the start was terrible. The end was fantastic. And the start was fantastic. And they ultimately, God kind of let them off the hook, but they didn't fully do what God said, and they suffered for it for a long time. Even though they still were people of faith, sometimes people of faith just can't take it all the way, to the end. So that's good.
The Ecclesiastes writer said, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. That's how you end.
Yep, yep.
It's a big deal.
What else we got left? Stan, see your hand. Let's go to the bookend of these people.
I'm going to have to do a little bit.
So this is Israelites again at the Red Sea. And the scripture says that they left Egypt boldly, and even as they were pursued by the Pharaoh. So, they started off good. I think that they were following the leadership of God, but they also were following Moses. Moses had that direct line to God, and in a lot of this story, Moses is told to take the rod and stretch it over the sea, and they saw all this happen. And also on the other end, he put his hand over the sea, but they did walk into that that dry land with walls of water on both sides. And that would take,
Courage.
some courage, absolutely, because I've never seen anything like that before. They hadn't either, and they had a group of people that were bent to capture and harm behind them. So they went, and they did what they were told to do, and they got it done. So all that happened. At the end of the whole story, they composed that song of Moses and praised God for helping them through all that. They recognized that God was the compelling force that helped them through all that. On the negative side, it's interesting to note that God, when He led them out of Egypt, He sent them towards the Red Sea rather than towards Philistia, or the Philistines. And He did that on purpose, because if they would have gone towards the Philistines, which was much closer, there would have been a war, and God acknowledged that if they had seen war, they would want to return to Egypt, and so He took them the long way. So even God recognized that there was a weakness, in the Israelites, that He chose to go that direction. And of course, the other thing that we see all the time with the Israelites through that 40 years is they complained. And it didn't take them long to get down the road, and they complained to Moses, saying, why have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? you know, and so that had to be addressed almost from the get-go on this. So, you know, they showed a lot of good here in terms of following, but the future was being predicted here in terms of how they handled things.
You mean to say God's people can complain?
They did. I suspect it's still going
Well,
on.
we all do. Yeah, we do.
But what's interesting about this, because we look at this and go, well, why is this in here? Because the Israelites are, that was an episode, but then they kind of all fell away. But did they? All fall away? Did that lesson of the Red Sea, did somebody get that lesson of the Red Sea?
Well,
Joshua and Caleb and
well,
the
yeah,
spies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we think about all the Israelites, but those 12 Israelites, they got exactly the point. It's like, well, if God did this, I don't care how tall this guy is in the land, I can take him on because God did that, you know. And that was that lesson that if all 2 million of them would have learned it, we wouldn't have needed Hebrews chapter 5 and 6, right? Talking about them pulling back from taking Israel.
You wonder about it a little bit, you know, thinking back, because they did. They saw Moses put his hand over and that water divided. They walked across dry land with water on both sides. They saw it crash down onto the Egyptians once they got over there. They had a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. They saw all this stuff, you know. Why would you complain, you know? There was something not quite, you know, I don't understand it. But then...
What happened and how they wanted it to, however that was,
yeah,
right?
So.
It's a human nature.
John?
I was just thinking, I think their main problem was that they were fearful. At least in the land of Egypt, they were used to being a slave and being in slavery, and they had food to eat and they had a place to live and whatever. So in the desert, everything's iffy. Food, water, even though they had seen all of God's miracles, it is like human nature. It's like
Fear of the unknown.
Fear of the unknown,
Yeah.
and worry.
Good. Well, I have one more report to give, right? You've got one, Tate.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I struggled with this a lot because I had not only personally not had a lot of experience with Enoch, but also, even through my research, he's only mentioned a very few times. And so as far as the strengths, it's so that he walked faithfully his whole life. So that was the most obvious. He was one of only 2 people taken directly into heaven, so that obviously had the full significance as well. With the weaknesses, that's where I really struggled because there was hardly anything there.
Nothing. The Bible tells us nothing, right?
Yeah, so the only thing that I was like, okay, he was only human. Like, he could only do so much.
You're good.
That was like the kind of like an obvious, like everyone is, but the only other thing was like that he couldn't necessarily prove God's existence as, you know, Jesus could with like performing miracles and
That's right.
things like that.
It really, I mean, it's really interesting. And so when you think about, you know, we've kind of been making this point as we go, so I'm not going to draw this back together because I want to take us to how the Hebrew writer ends this chapter here, because this is, I mean, you've done a fantastic job. And you think about it, the Hebrews would have known these characters even better than we know. So bringing all this out, the Hebrew, what's he giving them? It's like, yes, imperfect people, when they show faith and endurance, become people that God is approved of, God approves of. Remember what's Hebrews doing? We got people in Hebrews who are thinking about going back. It's getting hard. There's being a struggle. And so when he takes this, he goes through all these lists of people, and remember what he does next? And this is why some people say this was really a sermon meant to be read in one session, because what he does next, he says, time won't permit me to tell you about. Well, if he's writing a book, you can write his time, you all the time in the world, right? But what does he say? He went through all these people we talked about, And then he says, Samuel and the prophets, Hebrews 11:33. I want you to think about these things. There's two different categories of things he's going to bring forward now in these nameless people of faith. Okay? Who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Let's stop right there. Who stopped the mouth? You got Daniel there, right? David killed a lion doing that. So would they have been thinking of names when he said this? Absolutely. We can go back to the Old Testament and we can pull up multiple characters, some of whom we've talked about, some of whom we haven't talked about, who this is true of. Stop the mouths of lions. Quench the violence of fire. Who do we think of there? The wood in the fire? The three Hebrew boys, right? Escape the edge of the sword. Who had to run for their life? How many times did David run for his life? Who had to run for their life? Escape the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. Samson had all his hair cut off. Look what he did. Look what he did in the end. I've got names and names here that I listed here, and I'm glad you all's reports went so long that I'm not going through all that. Became valiant in battle. Anybody could show up to battle afraid and become valiant in battle? Think about all the people that we've talked about. Turn to flight the armies of aliens. All those things that women received their dead raised to life again. Did that happen in the Old Testament? Was there dead people raised? Yeah. Elijah and his successor Elisha. And the widow Zarephath and the woman of, anyway, the widow Zarephath and the Shunammite became that. Okay. What are all of those? What did the faith produce for all of those people? Are those good endings? Somebody's raised from the dead, got courage, right? Faith produced in all of those people who decided to have faith and endure. It produced something in their lives that they tangibly could see that was a good ending. Now, watch what happens next. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. We can talk about that in another class, but what does that mean? I'm going to decide to allow them to torture me instead of capitulating and losing my faith because what do I see? What do we see in Hebrews 6? They saw a better city whose builder and maker is God. They understood that there's something better than this. If I don't get a reward in this life, that's okay. There's something better than this thing. Others had trials of mockings and scourgings, and of chains and imprisonment. What happened to Jeremiah? Anybody remember that? Jeremiah ain't listed here. What happened to him? Got thrown naked in a pit, right?
He was put in stocks. He was let down in a dungeon. He suffered it all.
They were stoned. They were sawn in two. Tradition in Israel, tradition said that Isaiah actually died exactly like that. The Bible didn't reveal that, but they might have thought about that and looked at that. They were tempted. Was Joseph tempted? We're going to see that here, I think, in a few minutes. They were slain with the sword. Some people who showed faith escaped the sword. Other people who showed faith died for it. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Now, what's the lesson here? When I show faith and endurance, what sometimes happens?
Bad things.
It can get rough.
It can get rough. It can get rough. Sometimes God lets things ease off for a while and does that. And then this is where we'll actually kind of start this rolling into chapter 12 next Sunday when we get there. But I want you to think about this phrase. Verse 38. Of whom the world was not worthy. Unbelievers were not worthy of these people walking the earth. Why? Were they such good people? Huh? They weren't worthy of somebody who showed this kind of faith. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. Unbelievers are not worthy of us when we show this kind of faith. But you know what we have to do anyway? Walk amongst them while we're here, showing this kind of faith. Because this is the kind of faith that God is pleased with. whether it leads us to overcome a difficult situation and then move on with our lives, or whether it's the situation that ends our life. He expects to see that kind of faith. And the Hebrew writer says God's characterization of these people, the world's not worthy of you when you do that. The world's not worthy of people who are faithful. Because what is the world? All unfaithful unbelievers. Except, here's a little thing to think about. Who were we before? Unfaithful unbelievers. And if the Hebrews went back, what were they going to become? Unfaithful unbelievers. There's the end of the chapter. And what's his point of all these faithful people? This is what God's pleased with. Regardless of what he asks you to suffer through, here's what will please him. Get about doing that. Great reports from you all. And we will jump in and Homestretch chapter 12, boy, it's one chapter. And we're going to kind of put the Hebrews writer's point to this whole list in chapter 12. We're going to see exactly what he wants us to do with it. Thanks very much. Let's enjoy Jordan now.